It was a cool night in Charlotte, and downtown was bustling with the typical Friday night activity. Dr. David Robinson, a renowned physician at the local hospital, was walking toward an upscale restaurant known for its serene ambience and sophisticated dishes. He needed a moment to unwind after a grueling 12-hour shift in the emergency room. With his lab coat already folded away in the car, he was now dressed in a simple button-down shirt and dark jeans. Upon entering the restaurant, he was greeted by a host who, although polite, seemed to scrutinize him for a moment longer than necessary. "Good evening, sir," the host said with a formal smile. "Do you have a reservation?" "No, but I hope it's not a problem," David replied, maintaining his usual calm and courtesy. He was accustomed to being met with a slight suspicion in more upscale places. This was nothing new. "Of course, we have a table available. Please follow me." David was led to a corner table with a view of the busy street. He sat down, trying to put the discomfort behind him and focus on his meal. The soft music in the background and the refined atmosphere promised a peaceful evening. After ordering a glass of red wine and a plate of risotto, he allowed himself to relax. While he waited, he glanced around and observed the patrons in the restaurant. Many seemed to ignore his presence, but occasionally he noticed quick glances and whispers. This happened more often than he would like to admit. He was used to the mix of admiration and distrust, but it was still exhausting. His phone buzzed. It was his wife, Lisa. "Hey, love," she said when he answered. "Are you already having dinner?" "Yes, I just got a table," David replied, glancing at the waiter passing by. "How are the kids?" "They're fine. Sarah is doing her homework, and Noah is playing video games. I was going to ask if you want me to make something, but I figured you might want to get out a bit," she said. David smiled, although Lisa couldn't see him. "That's right. I needed some time for myself. The hospital was chaotic today. It seems like it never ends." Lisa sighed on the other end of the line. "I can imagine. You deserve a break, David. Enjoy your night." "I'll try," he said, looking around again. "I'll call you later." "Okay. Love you." "Love you too," David said before hanging up. As he put his phone away, he felt a shift in the atmosphere. The restaurant's soft hum seemed more tense, and some people were staring at him more persistently. Ignoring the growing discomfort, he picked up the menu again, determined to focus on the meal that would soon arrive. Then, 2 police officers walked into the restaurant. David noticed them as soon as they came through the door, but didn't pay them much attention. However, when one of the officers began walking directly toward his table, he frowned. "Good evening, sir," said the officer, stopping next to David's table. His tone was rigid, almost accusatory. "Good evening," David replied, confused but maintaining his composure. "Could you please stand up? We have a few questions for you," the officer continued, his gaze cold and authoritative. David blinked, not understanding what was happening. "Excuse me, but is there a mistake? I'm just here for dinner." The other officer approached, now with a hand resting on his belt near his weapon. The atmosphere around David's table became immediately heavy. "We received a report," said the second officer in a graver voice. "There's a suspicion that someone matching your description is involved in a theft in this area." David was stunned for a moment. "A theft?" he repeated incredulously. "I think you've made a mistake. I'm a doctor. I'm here just to have dinner." The officers exchanged glances. "We'll verify that later. For now, we need you to stand up and come with us," insisted the first officer, now more impatient. David felt a knot in his stomach. Conversations around him seemed to die down, and he noticed several curious and shocked looks directed at him. "I've already told you that you're making a mistake. I'm Dr. David Robinson. I work at the local hospital," he said, keeping his tone calm despite the anger boiling inside him. "That's not what we're asking right now. Please cooperate and come with us," the officer said, extending his hand to handcuff him. David's heart raced. He wasn't just being accused. He was being publicly humiliated for something he hadn't done. The air in the restaurant felt thick, almost suffocating. The low murmur of the patrons ceased, replaced by an uncomfortable silence. Dr. David Robinson remained seated, bewildered by the situation. The 2 officers next to him stood firm, waiting for him to comply. The first officer repeated the request, this time with more firmness. "Sir, we ask that you cooperate. Stand up and come with us," the officer said, his hand now close to the belt where the handcuffs were hanging. David felt his blood boil. It wasn't the first time he'd faced racism disguised as suspicion, but this public humiliation was an unexpected blow. "I've already said," David began, trying to stay calm. "You're making a mistake. I'm a doctor, and I have absolutely nothing to do with any crime. You can check my documents." The second officer shook his head impatiently. "Listen, sir, it's just a routine check. If you really have nothing to do with this, everything will be cleared up quickly. But for now, we need you to cooperate." David stared at the two men, feeling the weight of the eyes on him. He looked at the restaurant manager, who was not far away, clearly uncomfortable but lacking the courage to intervene. He knew that, in a way, this complaint might have come from a customer who had looked at him strangely when he arrived. "And if I refuse?" David asked, testing the limits. The first officer pressed his lips together. "I really wouldn't recommend that, sir. We don't want to escalate this further. Stand up." David let out a frustrated sigh. He knew that any resistance could quickly escalate into something much worse. Even though he was right, even being a respected member of the community, at that moment, in the eyes of the police, he was nothing more than a suspect. "All right, I'll cooperate," he said, standing up slowly. As he stood, the second officer stepped forward, grabbing him by the arm. David flinched instinctively at the rough touch. "There's no need for that," he protested, pulling his arm back. "It's just a procedure, sir," the officer responded with the same coldness. "We need to keep you under control while we sort this out." As they placed the handcuffs on him, David felt a wave of indignation and shame wash over him. The room seemed to spin. He looked around, searching for a sympathetic face among the patrons who were clearly shocked. But no one moved, no one spoke up in his defense. The murmurs started again, louder this time. "But he doesn't look like a thief," a woman whispered from a few feet away. "You never know, do you?" came another quiet voice. The restaurant manager finally gathered his courage and approached hesitantly. "Excuse me, officers, what's going on here?" he asked, shooting an apologetic glance at David. "It's just a routine check," replied the first officer as he finished securing David's handcuffs. "I know him. He's a regular here," the manager insisted, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. "Isn't there another way to handle this?" David looked at the manager, trying to maintain his dignity despite the cuffs around his wrists. "A routine check?" David repeated, his tone bitter. "This is what you call handcuffing me in front of everyone? I'm a doctor, for God's sake." "Sir, we'll clear this up once we get to the station," the officer responded tersely. The manager stepped back, raising his hands in a gesture of surrender. "I tried, doctor," he murmured, visibly uncomfortable. David shook his head, frustrated by the passivity of those around him. "Tried?" He looked into the manager's eyes. "So tell me, did you call the police on me?" The manager appeared visibly tense. "It wasn't me, doctor. I swear. I'm just trying to help," he responded, almost whispering. David was silent for a moment. He knew the manager was probably telling the truth. Someone, somewhere in that restaurant, had made the call. And that someone likely thought a black man in a fancy restaurant wasn't normal. As he was led outside, the only thing echoing in his mind was the humiliation. Outside the restaurant, the night air felt heavier than usual. The Charlotte sky was clear, but for Dr. David Robinson, the darkness weighed heavily. With the handcuffs tight on his wrists, he walked between the two officers toward the patrol car parked in front, aware of the stares from everyone around. The bustling streets seemed to have stopped. It was as if the world was watching, but no one dared to intervene. "This is ridiculous," he murmured as the officers shoved him toward the car. "Sir, we ask for your cooperation. We'll resolve this as quickly as possible," repeated the officer, the same vague, automatic response as before. David stopped, turning to face the officers with contained anger. "I'm Dr. David Robinson. You can call the hospital. I've been a respected physician in this city for over 15 years, and you're treating me like a common criminal. This is a mistake, and you know it." The officers exchanged brief glances. The second one, who seemed to be the more authoritative of the two, looked sternly at David. "Sir, it's not about who you are. It's about what was reported. We have a report of someone matching your description being involved in a theft in the area." David shook his head, frustrated. "My description? What description? A black man? Because that's what it seems like. You handcuffed me in public without even properly checking the situation." The first officer, visibly uncomfortable, tried to ease the tension. "Dr. Robinson, we understand your frustration, but we have to follow protocol. If you have nothing to do with this, you'll be cleared soon. We can sort this out at the station." David let out a bitter laugh. "Protocol? This is about skin color, and you know it. If I were a white man sitting in that restaurant, none of this would have happened." The officer didn't respond, only opening the patrol car door and gesturing for David to get in. Reluctantly, with a heavy heart, he entered the vehicle, the sound of the doors closing echoing in his mind like a final blow of humiliation. As the patrol car began to move, David looked out the window, seeing the faces of people on the sidewalks and in the restaurant. Some continued dining as if nothing had happened, while others looked at him, curious or shocked. No one did anything. No one tried to help or question what was going on. David sighed deeply and closed his eyes. Images from his day at the hospital started to flood his mind. The lives he had saved, the patients he had cared for with empathy and dedication. He wasn't just a doctor. He was a pillar in his community, and now he was being treated like a common criminal for nothing more than racial assumptions. "I just want to clear this up quickly," he murmured, more to himself than to the officers. At the station, the following hours were a grueling repetition of questions and answers. The officers eventually verified his documents and identity, and the truth emerged. David Robinson, 42, was indeed Dr. Robinson, one of the most respected doctors at the local hospital. The public humiliation had no basis, and the theft accusation, of course, was a gross error. When one of the detectives came to speak with David in the interrogation room, he seemed genuinely apologetic. "Dr. Robinson, we'd like to apologize for the mistake. Apparently, there was a misunderstanding with the suspect's description." David looked at the man coldly. "A misunderstanding? You dragged me out of a restaurant, handcuffed me in public, and now it's just a misunderstanding? Do you realize that this kind of mistake has consequences? That it affects not just me, but the entire community I serve?" The detective sighed. "We understand your frustration. This should not have happened like this." David stood up, still angry but too tired to continue the argument. "It's not just frustration. It's racism disguised as public safety. I expected better, especially from you." The detective nodded, lacking the words to respond. After all, he knew David was right. Before leaving the station, one of the officers who had handcuffed him tried to approach. "Dr. Robinson, No," David interrupted, his voice sharp. "Don't say anything more. I just want to go home." The officer stepped back, and David left the station without looking back, still processing what had just happened. As he exited the station, David felt the weight of the last few hours on his shoulders. He was a man accustomed to pressure, to the responsibility of saving lives. But the humiliation he had suffered that night was something entirely different. Each step toward his car felt heavier. The city noise continued around him, indifferent to what he had just endured. When he finally got into his car and closed the door, he felt, for the first time that night, somewhat shielded. He took a deep breath and grabbed his phone. He needed to tell Lisa what had happened. He knew she would be worried. The phone rang twice before Lisa answered. "David." Lisa's voice sounded relieved but worried. "Where are you? Are you okay? I was getting worried. You've been gone for hours." "Lisa," he began. His voice choked. Something happened. Something really bad. There was a pause on the other end of the line. "What happened?" she asked, her tone instantly more serious. David took a deep breath, trying to find the right words to explain what he had just been through. "I was having dinner, like I told you, and 2 police officers showed up. They accused me of being involved in a theft. They handcuffed me in the middle of the restaurant, Lisa, right in front of everyone. They took me to the station like I was a criminal." "What?" Lisa's voice was a mix of shock and anger. "They handcuffed you? David, this is outrageous. Didn't they even check who you were?" "No, of course not." he replied, bitterness evident in his voice. I told them who I was, that I was a doctor, but that didn't matter. To them, I was just another suspicious black man. And now, they just say it was a misunderstanding. Lisa was silent for a few seconds, processing what her husband had just shared. When she finally spoke, her voice was loaded with emotion. David, this is unacceptable. They can't treat you like this, treat anyone like this. This can't be left as is. David rubbed his face, feeling the mental and physical exhaustion take over. I know, but what can I do now? I just want to go home and forget about tonight. No, David, Lisa said firmly. We can't let this go. If you do nothing, they'll keep doing this to others. You're a respected doctor. You have a voice that people will listen to. You need to speak up about this. David took a deep breath, his wife's words slowly sinking in. He knew Lisa was right. It wasn't just about him. It was about all the black people suffering from the same kind of abuse and institutional racism. Maybe, he said, still hesitant, but I don't know if I'm ready to deal with this right now. I'm so tired, Lisa. I understand, David, and I'm here for you. But please, think about it. It can't end like this. You have the right to be angry, but you also have the power to change something. David knew his wife was right. Lisa had always been his anchor, the person who kept him steady during tough times. But that night, all he wanted was to go home, hug his kids, and forget. Yet, deep down, he knew that wouldn't be possible. Okay, I'll think about it, he said finally. Please do, David. We'll talk more about it when you get home. Just come home. We're waiting for you. I'm on my way, he replied, feeling a slight relief at hearing his wife's words. David hung up the phone and looked at the city around him. The lights of Charlotte blinked as always, as if nothing had changed. But for him, something had shifted. Something deep and painful. What had happened that night was more than just an injustice. It was a brutal reminder of the reality he lived in, even as a respected and successful man. With a deep sigh, he started the car and drove toward home. But the sense of humiliation still lingered, like a shadow that wouldn't leave him soon. David arrived home late that night. As he opened the door, he felt the momentary relief of being in the place where he felt safest. The familiar smell of Lisa's dinner was still in the air, and he heard light footsteps approaching. Lisa appeared at the living room door with a worried and tense expression. "Are you okay?" she asked softly, moving closer and hugging him tightly. David let out a long sigh, feeling the warmth of his wife's embrace. He held her close for a moment, as if trying to shake off the weight of the humiliation that still hung over him. "I don't know, Lisa," he replied, his voice low. "I'm still processing everything that happened." She let go of him but kept her hands on his shoulders, looking into his eyes. "That was so wrong, David. I still can't believe what you told me." David wiped his forehead, as if trying to erase the memories of that night. It was surreal. He paused. "I always thought that being a doctor, reaching where I've reached, these things wouldn't affect me anymore. But somehow, who I am seems not to matter." Lisa watched him intently, her eyes filled with empathy but also with a quiet anger. "Unfortunately, that's the reality for so many of us," she said, her voice calm but heavy with pain. "No matter how successful you are, they still see you just as a black man. And that has to change, David. They need to hear your voice." David shook his head, thoughtful. "I know you're right, but I don't know if I want to fight this battle now. Today, I just want to forget what happened, Lisa. I have an important surgery tomorrow. I need to focus on that." Lisa sighed and pulled David over to the couch. "I understand you're tired, but I don't think you'll be able to just forget. You're a role model in the community, David. Maybe that's precisely why you need to speak out. Show that even a respected doctor, someone with your career, isn't immune to this kind of racism." David looked down, the weight of Lisa's words settling on him. "And if I speak out, Lisa?" he asked, more to himself. "What will that really change? They'll keep doing this to others. I'll just be another story in the news." "But your story could be an awakening for many," she said with conviction. "David, people know you, respect you. If you speak out, it could inspire others to stand up against these abuses too." David remained silent for a moment, reflecting on what his wife was saying. He knew Lisa was right, but the truth was he was exhausted. It wasn't just physical fatigue. It was the exhaustion of fighting against biases that seemed immutable, as if no matter how far he came, how successful he was, he would always be judged by the color of his skin. "I understand what you're saying," David began, rising and walking to the window. "But for now, I don't know if I can handle this. I already deal with so many lives in my hands every day. Do I have the energy to fight this battle too?" Lisa came up to him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "I'm not saying you have to solve everything right now. I just think you shouldn't let this die inside you. Because if you, who have a voice, don't speak out, who will?" David looked out the window, the darkness of the night reflecting his own thoughts. He knew Lisa was right, but at that moment, he didn't have the answer. All he felt was the pain, anger, and humiliation of that night. "I just need some time," he said, turning to her. "Some time to process everything. I promise I'll think about what you said, but right now I just need to breathe." Lisa nodded, understanding. "I'll be here, whatever your decision is. But know that you're not alone in this." David pulled her into another embrace, feeling his wife's silent support. "I know. Thank you, Lisa." They stayed there in silence as the night wore on. David knew that what happened that night wouldn't be something he could simply forget. And somehow, he knew that the decision to speak out or not would come soon. But for now, he was focused on simply moving forward, one step at a time. The next morning, David woke up early, but the feeling of discomfort hadn't left him. The sun was beginning to light up the horizon, but for him, the light couldn't dispel the darkness he carried in his chest since the night before. As he got ready for work, his mind repeatedly wandered back to the moment he was handcuffed, the public humiliation still echoing in his thoughts. In the kitchen, Lisa watched him in silence as he made coffee. She knew something was wrong, that the previous night was still consuming him, even though he tried to hide it. After a few minutes of silence, she decided to break the tension. "Did you sleep well?" she asked softly. David shrugged, not looking directly at her. "More or less. I couldn't stop thinking about everything." She moved closer, lightly touching his arm. "It's normal, David. What happened was unjust, and it's not going to disappear overnight." He sighed, finally turning to face her. "I know, Lisa, but I can't keep dwelling on it. I have patients waiting for me, a complicated surgery scheduled for today. I can't let what happened interfere with my work." Lisa nodded, understanding but still worried. "I get it, but I just want you to know you don't have to go through this alone. You could talk to someone, maybe a friend, or even at the hospital." David chuckled without humor. "Talk to whom?" "At the hospital. I'm the competent doctor. No one there will understand what happened or how I'm feeling. To them, it's just another isolated incident, something they can easily distance themselves from. But for me, it's different." Lisa watched him closely, sensing the depth of the anguish he was trying to hide. "Don't underestimate the support of the people around you, David. They might not know what you're feeling, but many of them care about you." David sighed again, running a hand over his tired face. "I know, but right now, all I want to do is focus on what I know how to do. Save lives. The rest, I'll deal with later." She nodded, realizing he still needed time. She knew pressing him now wouldn't help. "Okay, I'll be here when you're ready to talk." David gave a slight smile, grateful for Lisa's support. Even without words, he felt the comfort her presence provided. "Thanks. I really appreciate it." After a brief silence, David finished his coffee, grabbed his briefcase, and got ready to leave. "I need to go. The hospital is expecting me." Lisa kissed his cheek before he went out the door. "Take care, David. And remember, you don't have to carry this weight alone." He nodded, but as he drove to the hospital, the weight of the conversation stayed with him. Upon arriving at the hospital, his colleagues greeted him as usual, unaware of what had happened the night before. It felt like he was living in two worlds: the competent, respected doctor and the black man who had been unjustly humiliated. During the first surgery of the day, David was more focused than ever. Every move was precise, every decision calculated. He knew the success of that operation could mean the difference between life and death for his patient. But behind the calm exterior, His mind was still tormented by the experience of the previous night. At the end of the procedure, while washing his hands, a longtime colleague, Dr. Anderson, approached. "Perfect surgery, as always, David," Anderson said, smiling. "You seem to have the ability to make everything look easy." David forced a smile, but inside, the emotional battle he was facing was relentless. "Thanks, Anderson. Just doing my job." Anderson looked at him with a curious expression. "Are you okay? You seem distracted today. Is something going on?" David hesitated for a moment. Could he trust Anderson? He was a colleague with whom he'd always had a good relationship, but the reality was that many of his white colleagues didn't live or understand the struggles David faced daily. "Nothing work-related," he answered, choosing to evade. "Just a rough night." Anderson nodded, accepting the superficial response. "Well, if you need to talk about anything, I'm here. I know it's easy to get lost in the rhythm of this place, but it's important to take care of ourselves too." David gave a nod of thanks. "I appreciate that, Anderson. Thanks." As he prepared for his next appointment, David's mind was in turmoil. Could he continue to ignore what had happened? Pretend that the public humiliation wasn't affecting his emotional well-being? Or was it time, as Lisa suggested, to share his experience and confront the impact it had on his life and how he viewed the world around him? The decision was still unclear, but he knew he couldn't hide forever. David finished the day exhausted, but the emotional discomfort lingered, clinging like a shadow. As he drove back home, the scenes of the humiliating night at the restaurant replayed like a nightmare he couldn't shake off. The sound of sirens, the clinking of handcuffs. He still felt the indignation burning inside him. When he arrived home, he saw his kids playing in the yard. He always felt an immediate calm when he saw them, as if the world lightened for a few moments. As he opened the door, Lisa was in the kitchen, preparing dinner. She turned when she heard his steps. "Hi, honey. How was your day?" she asked, smiling gently but with a scrutinizing look. David forced a smile as he hung up his coat. "Tiring, but I got through the surgeries without any issues." Lisa noticed he was still distant. She knew the emotional wound from the night before hadn't healed. Moving closer to him, Lisa gave him a light hug. "I know it's not all okay yet, David. Do you want to talk?" she asked softly. David sighed, feeling the weight of the words he'd been holding in all day. "I don't know, Lisa. All of this, what happened at the restaurant, I can't stop thinking about it. What hurts the most is that somehow I felt powerless." Lisa furrowed her brow, listening intently. "Powerless how?" He pulled away from her hug and started pacing the room, his thoughts flowing chaotically. "Powerless for not having done anything at the moment. You know, I'm a doctor. People look up to me at the hospital, but there, at the restaurant, I was just another suspect. They didn't even ask who I was. I was judged before I even opened my mouth." Lisa watched him with silent pain, but knew he needed to vent. "David, you didn't do anything wrong. They treated you in an unacceptable way, but that's not a reflection of who you are. It's a reflection of a society that still discriminates, still judges by skin color." He stopped pacing and looked at her, frustration clear on his face. "I know that, Lisa, but that doesn't lessen the shame I felt. Everyone at the restaurant treating me like I was a criminal. And what did I do? I just accepted it. Let them handcuff me, take me away. I didn't fight back." Lisa stepped closer, her voice calm but firm. "You didn't fight back because you were in shock, David, and because you knew that fighting could have had even worse consequences. You did what you could to protect yourself. Don't blame yourself for that." David rubbed his face, trying to push away the frustration. "But what do I do now? Do I pretend it didn't happen? Go back to my life as if everything is fine? Because, honestly, I don't know if I can do that." Lisa nodded, understanding his internal dilemma. "I don't think you should pretend nothing happened, and you don't have to deal with this alone. Maybe talking to others, sharing what happened. It might help you process things better." He thought for a moment. Lisa's words made sense, but there was something deeper, something he had been trying to ignore, but was now beginning to surface. "Lisa, I've been through situations like this before," he admitted, his voice low. "When I was younger, before becoming a doctor, it was common. Being stopped by police, being watched suspiciously in stores. I always thought that as time went on, things would change. That when I became someone respectable, it would stop. But now, I see that nothing has changed. She moved closer, holding his hands. It's hard to hear that, David. And I know it hurts to realize that even with all the success you've achieved, this reality still exists. But you're also a powerful voice. And maybe now is the time for you to use that voice to help change things for others going through the same thing. David took a deep breath, feeling the weight of Lisa's words. He knew she was right, but he also knew that taking on this responsibility would be exhausting and emotionally draining. He wasn't sure if he was ready for that. Maybe, he said hesitantly, but I don't know if I'm ready to open up like that. I'm still processing everything. Lisa nodded, understanding. And that's okay. What happened to you wasn't minor, David. You have the right to feel all of this and take the time you need to figure out what to do next. David was silent for a moment, Lisa's words echoing in his mind. He knew she was there to support him, but the weight of deciding how to handle the situation still pressed on him. I'll think about it, he finally said, looking into Lisa's eyes. But for now, I just want to spend time with you guys. Be with my kids. They're the only thing that makes me forget, even if just for a moment. Lisa smiled and squeezed his hands. Let's have dinner then. They've been eagerly waiting to see Daddy. David nodded, and for the first time that day, he smiled genuinely. Let's go. I think I need this. As they walked together to the kitchen, David knew that what had happened couldn't be ignored forever. But for now, being with his family was the refuge he needed. The future would bring the answers and decisions he would have to make, but for that night, he would allow himself to be present with those he loved. The next day brought a sense of normalcy to the hospital, but David couldn't shake the feeling of unease that lingered. The humiliation was still fresh in his mind, and he wondered how he could continue his routine as if nothing had happened. During lunch, David met with some colleagues in the cafeteria. Among them was Dr. Anderson, who, despite a brief and cordial conversation, sensed David's tension. After some hesitation, Anderson decided to bring up the subject. David, do you have a minute? Anderson asked as the other colleagues began to disperse. David looked at him, a bit surprised, but nodded. Sure, Anderson. What's up? They moved to a quieter corner of the cafeteria. Anderson seemed hesitant, but had a genuinely concerned expression. I wanted to ask how you're really doing. Yesterday, you seemed, well, a bit shaken. David took a deep breath, knowing he couldn't hide what he felt any longer. He appreciated Anderson's concern but was still struggling to find the right words. It was a tough day, Anderson. I went through a humiliating experience at the restaurant last night. The police treated me disrespectfully, handcuffed me, and treated me like I was a criminal. And all of it for no reason. Anderson was shocked, his expression shifting from concern to a mix of empathy and indignation. My God, David. I had no idea. That's unacceptable. I'm so sorry you went through that. David shook his head, frustrated. I'm trying to process it all. It's not just the humiliation. It's the feeling of powerlessness. I always thought that being respected as a doctor would keep me above this, but it seems like nothing has changed. Anderson looked at him with understanding. You're not alone, David. This is a reflection of bigger problems in society, not of who you are as an individual. And maybe now, more than ever, is the time for you to use your voice to make a difference. David frowned, considering Anderson's words. I don't know if I'm ready for that. Talking about what happened feels so draining, and I'm afraid of how it might be received. Anderson put a hand on David's shoulder with an encouraging look. I understand your fear, but I also see the strength in you. If you speak out, not only might you find some relief, but you could also inspire others to face similar situations. Your story has power, David. David looked down, absorbing Anderson's words. He knew there was truth in what his colleague said, but he was still struggling with the emotional weight. I'll think about it, Anderson. Thanks for listening and caring. Anderson smiled with a gesture of encouragement. Always, David. And if you need anything, I'm here. David thanked him and went back to his work, feeling a little lighter for having shared his burden with someone who genuinely seemed to understand. Anderson's support was a relief, but the decision on how to proceed was still distant. Later that day, David met Lisa at a cafe. She knew he needed some time away from the hospital to think more clearly. As they talked, Lisa tried to be the constant support David needed. "How was your talk with Anderson?" she asked, her voice full of curiosity and hope. David looked at her, still reflecting on the conversation. "It was helpful. Anderson gave me some perspectives I hadn't considered. He thinks I should use my voice to speak about what happened. He says it might help bring about change." Lisa smiled, relieved to see David starting to open up to the idea. "And what do you think? Are you considering it?" David shook his head, thoughtful. "I'm thinking about it. But it's hard, Lisa. I feel like I'm still processing what happened. And part of me is afraid of the repercussions." Lisa looked at him with understanding and affection. "It's understandable to be afraid, David. But it's also important to remember that you're not alone. And your voice can be a powerful force for good." David smiled faintly, feeling supported by Lisa's constant presence. "Maybe you're right. Maybe it's time for me to start thinking about how I can do something positive with what happened." Lisa took David's hand, holding it gently. "Whatever you decide, I'll be by your side. And I know you'll find the right path." David looked at her, feeling a newfound sense of determination. "Thank you, Lisa. I really need that support." They spent the rest of the afternoon talking and planning, and David felt an unexpected lightness as he thought about the future. Although the road ahead was uncertain and challenging, he began to see a small light at the end of the tunnel. Anderson's words and Lisa's support were reminders that he wasn't alone, and that perhaps there was a way to turn his painful experience into something meaningful. The next morning, David woke up with renewed determination. He was resolved to start sharing his experience and using his voice to create change. The challenge was figuring out the first step, and he knew it would require courage and deep reflection on how to approach the issue effectively. After a busy morning at the hospital, David came home and met with Lisa, who was eager to hear about his next steps. "So, honey, have you decided what you're going to do?" Lisa asked, while making tea for both of them in the kitchen. David sat at the table, looking more confident than he had in recent days. "Yes, I've decided to start sharing my story. I can't just sit back and wait for things to change on their own. I need to do something." Lisa smiled, relieved and encouraged. "That's great, David. How do you plan to start?" David took a deep breath, looking at Lisa with a resolute expression. "I'm thinking of writing an article for the local newspaper, something that clearly and honestly describes what happened, and maybe participating in some community events to talk about it." Lisa nodded, admiring his determination. "That sounds like an excellent start. And as for the newspaper, have you thought about how you'll approach the issue?" David gave a slight smile, still fine-tuning his ideas. "Yes, I want to focus on the personal experience, but also highlight how it reflects a bigger problem in society. I want people to see that this isn't just an isolated incident, but a pattern affecting many people." Lisa took David's hand, squeezing it gently. "I'm sure your article will be powerful and make a difference. And if you need help with the writing or anything else, count on me." David appreciated the support, and with a renewed sense of purpose, he headed to his office to start working on the article. As he typed, the words flowed with a mix of pain and hope. He described the incident at the restaurant, the disrespectful treatment he had received, and reflected on the emotions he felt. At the same time, he made a connection between his personal experience and the broader impact of racial discrimination in society. When he finished the draft, he reviewed the text, focusing on conveying not just the facts but also the sense of injustice and the desire for change. Finally, he felt the article was ready to be sent. The next morning, David submitted the article to the local newspaper editor, hoping it would be accepted. While waiting for a response, he began preparing for his first community talk, an event organized by a local civil rights group. The idea was to share his story with the community and spark a conversation about racial discrimination. On the day of the event, David was nervous but also excited. He knew the talk was an opportunity to put a human face on the fight against racism and to start an important dialogue. Lisa was by his side, providing moral support as they approached the venue. "Are you ready?" she asked as they neared the conference room. David took a deep breath and smiled at her. "Yes, I am. A bit nervous, but ready. Thanks for being here." Lisa gave him a kiss on the cheek and encouraged him. "You're going to do great. Just speak from the heart, and people will listen." When David took the stage, he looked out at the audience with a mix of nervousness and determination. He adjusted the microphone and began speaking, his voice firm and clear. "Good evening, everyone. My name is David Johnson, and I'd like to share with you a personal experience that, unfortunately, reflects a much larger issue in our society." He then recounted the events of the night at the restaurant, his voice filled with emotion as he described the injustice he faced. He spoke about how the disrespectful treatment had affected him and how it led him to reflect on the persistence of racism. "What happened to me isn't an isolated case. Many people face similar situations every day, and it's important that we talk about it. Racial discrimination should not be acceptable anywhere, whether in a restaurant, in the hospital, or anywhere else." The audience was attentive, many with expressions of empathy and reflection. After finishing his speech, David answered questions from the audience, discussing not only his experience but also ways to combat discrimination and promote equality. After the event, David received many compliments and words of support. It was a relief for him to realize that his voice was being heard and that there were people willing to support the cause. Lisa was by his side, smiling and proud. "You did an amazing job, David. It was moving and powerful." David smiled, feeling a weight lift off his shoulders. "Thank you, Lisa. I felt like I was finally doing something positive with all of this, and that gives me hope." As they drove home, David felt a sense of accomplishment he hadn't experienced in the days before. Although the fight against racism was an ongoing and challenging battle, he was beginning to see the impact of his actions. And for the first time since the incident, he felt a bit more hopeful about the future. David's life began to change in unexpected ways after his talk. His article in the newspaper was published and sparked a wave of discussions throughout the city. The impact was visible. People were talking about the issue of racial discrimination, and more importantly, they were starting to understand the importance of empathy and mutual respect. David met with a local reporter, Sarah Miller, who was interested in doing a more detailed piece on his story and the impact of his speech. "Dr. Johnson, thank you for meeting with me. Your talk made quite an impact, and I'd like to explore your journey further and what you hope to achieve with this," Sarah said, adjusting her recorder as David settled into a chair. David nodded, feeling a mix of nervousness and determination. "I'm happy to talk about it, Sarah. I hope my story can inspire change and help people realize that racial discrimination is a reality we need to confront." Sarah began the interview with questions about the events at the restaurant and how they impacted David personally and professionally. David's responses were deep and reflective, revealing the pain and hope he felt. "How do you feel now, knowing that your story is sparking discussions and change?" Sarah asked. David looked at her, his eyes showing a new confidence. "I feel a mix of relief and hope. Talking about what happened was an important step for me, and seeing people's reactions makes me feel that maybe, just maybe, we can start to change things." Sarah smiled, admiring David's resilience. "What do you think needs to happen next for this change to become a reality?" David paused for a moment, his gaze distant as if he were envisioning a better future. "I believe we need more open conversations about racism and discrimination. People need to hear real experiences and understand that by ignoring these issues, we are perpetuating the suffering. We also need concrete actions in our communities and in policies." The interview ended on a positive note, and David felt content to have the opportunity to continue discussing racial discrimination. However, despite all the recognition he was receiving, he still carried a sense of inner dissatisfaction. He was making progress, but the struggle felt endless. Later that day, David returned home and found Lisa waiting for him. She noticed that he seemed more contemplative than usual. "How did the interview go?" Lisa asked as they prepared dinner together. David sighed as he chopped vegetables for the salad. "It went well. I felt like I got my message across. But even so, I still feel like we're just scratching the surface. There's so much more to be done." Lisa looked at him with understanding. "I understand, David. Change doesn't happen overnight, but you're making a difference. Every step counts." David gave a faint smile but still seemed distant. "Sometimes it's hard to see progress when the problem seems so big. But I know I can't give up. If I stop fighting, nothing will change." Lisa moved closer and held David's hands. "And you're not going to give up. I'm sure of that. And remember, you're not alone in this journey. Many people are by your side and support what you're doing. David squeezed Lisa's hand with gratitude. Thank you for always being here for me. Your support makes a huge difference. As they had dinner, David reflected on the impact of his work and the challenges he would still face. He knew there was much more to be done, but he also felt a renewed sense of purpose. The journey of sharing his story and fighting against racial discrimination wasn't just about him, but about creating a legacy of change and justice for future generations. As the evening went on, David felt a bit lighter. The struggle continued, but he was ready to face it with the same determination and hope he had found along the way. He knew that despite the difficulties, every step toward awareness and dialogue was a step toward a fairer and more inclusive future. Time passed, and David continued to see the impact of his fight and the changes he had begun to spark. The number of people approaching him to discuss racism and discrimination had grown, and he frequently participated in community events and debates. Though there were moments of frustration, there were also moments of gratification and progress. On a chilly November afternoon, David was preparing for an important event, a conference on racial equality taking place at the Atlanta University Auditorium. The event would attract a diverse audience, including scholars, activists, and community members. It was an opportunity for David to speak about his experiences and discuss solutions for combating racial discrimination. Before leaving the house, David found Lisa in the kitchen, where she was making coffee for both of them. Ready for the conference? Lisa asked with an encouraging look as she poured the coffee. David took a cup and smiled. Yes, I am. A little nervous but excited. I think it will be a good chance to expand the discussion about what I've been through and what we need to do to make changes. Lisa handed David the cup and held his hands. You'll do great. Remember, your story has already inspired many people. Trust yourself and your message. David nodded, feeling the warmth and support of Lisa's words. Thanks, Lisa. I just hope what I say makes a difference. Later, at the university auditorium, the room was packed, and the atmosphere was one of anticipation and seriousness. David took the stage and looked at the audience, taking a deep breath before beginning his speech. He felt the weight of responsibility, but also the certainty that his voice mattered. Good afternoon, everyone, David began, his voice firm and clear. I appreciate each of you being here. Today, I want to talk about a personal experience that led me on a journey of reflection and action regarding racial discrimination. He shared his story, detailing the incident at the restaurant and how it had deeply affected him. He talked about the conversations he had, the events he participated in, and the ongoing challenges he faced. At the end of his speech, David emphasized the need for systematic change and the role each individual plays in the fight against racism. What I experienced was a personal humiliation, but also a reflection of a much larger issue. Racial discrimination is not just a one-night problem. It's a reality affecting millions of people every day. We need a collective effort to create a world where respect and equality are the norm. After the talk, David was approached by several attendees, including some students and activists who expressed their admiration for his courage and commitment. Dr. Johnson, your talk was amazing. I really feel inspired to do more, said a young student, enthusiastically. David smiled, feeling gratified. I'm glad it was inspiring. We all have a role to play in the fight for equality. It's an ongoing effort, and we need to keep pushing for change. As David spoke with the attendees, an older woman approached him. She looked emotional, her hands slightly trembling as she held a conference brochure. Dr. Johnson, I'm a retired teacher, and hearing your story reminded me of many similar moments I've witnessed over the years. Your work is important and necessary. Thank you for having the courage to speak out. David looked at her with a sincere smile. I appreciate your words. It's crucial that we continue to dialogue and educate about these issues. Change begins with awareness and the effort of all of us. After the event, David and Lisa went home, exhausted but satisfied with the conference's impact. During dinner, David reflected on the day. It was a good event. I felt like I was able to convey the message effectively and really heard from people who were touched and motivated to act. Lisa smiled and poured a bit more wine. You did a wonderful job, David. Your message is reaching people and making a difference. David raised his wine glass, looking at Lisa with gratitude. Thanks, Lisa. Your support has been essential in all of this. I feel like, Even though there's still much to be done, we're on the right path. Lisa raised her glass in a toast to change and progress. May we continue moving forward and inspiring others to do the same. As they toasted and continued to talk about the day, David felt a renewed sense of purpose and hope. He knew the journey was long and filled with challenges, but the recognition and positive impact he was making gave him confidence that he was on the right path. The fight for equality and justice was a commitment he was ready to continue, with the strength and support of those who shared his vision of a fairer world. It was a sunny morning in Atlanta, and David was in a meeting with a group of community leaders and activists to discuss creating an educational program on diversity and inclusion for local schools. The room was filled with engaged and committed individuals. We're here to discuss how we can implement a program that teaches kids from an early age about respect, empathy, and equality, David said, addressing the group. The idea is to create a curriculum that not only informs but also inspires positive change. One of the activists, Maria, raised her hand and asked a question. David, how do you think the program will be received by the schools and the community? Will there be resistance? David thought for a moment before responding. It's possible that there will be resistance, especially in communities where the topic is more sensitive. However, our goal is to present it in a way that emphasizes the importance of empathy and mutual understanding. We want to show that diversity is a strength, not a threat. Another participant, a teacher named Mark, commented, I agree, David. I've had experiences where the topic of diversity was misunderstood. I think the key will be involving parents and teachers in the process and ensuring they understand the value of what we're trying to teach. David nodded, appreciating Mark's input. Exactly. And we need to provide resources and training for teachers so they feel prepared to address these topics with sensitivity and effectiveness. As the meeting continued, David felt energized by the enthusiasm and commitment of the group. They discussed the details of the program, such as creating educational materials, training teachers, and integrating it with the existing school curriculum. David knew the project would be a major challenge, but he was confident it was an important step toward promoting change. After the meeting, David met Lisa for lunch. They sat at a local cafe and talked about recent developments. The meeting was productive. The program is starting to take shape, and there's a lot of support for the idea, David said, with a smile on his face. Lisa looked at him proudly. That's wonderful, David. I see that you're making significant progress, and the way you're handling it is inspiring. David took Lisa's hand, expressing his gratitude. I couldn't have done this without your support. The journey has been long and challenging, but having you by my side has been a great comfort. Lisa squeezed his hand and smiled. And I'll always be here for you. What you're doing is important and impactful. And, above all, you're contributing to a better future for everyone. As lunch continued, David and Lisa discussed plans for the future and how they would continue to support each other. David was excited about the possibilities and the vision of a future where education on diversity and inclusion could make a real difference in people's lives. Later that evening, David was at home reviewing some documents when he received an unexpected call from a former colleague, Thomas. David, I heard about the educational program you're developing. I wanted to congratulate you on the amazing work and offer my help if you need it, Thomas said, sincerity in his voice. David was surprised and touched by the offer. Thanks, Thomas. I really appreciate that. We're at the beginning of a big project, and any help is welcome. Thomas continued. If you need support with organizing events or communicating with other schools, I'm here to help. I know how important it is to have a support network for these projects. David smiled, encouraged by Thomas's willingness to assist. That will be extremely helpful. Let's stay in touch and see how we can work together to ensure the success of the program. After hanging up, David felt renewed by the positive energy and support he was receiving. He knew that the fight for equality and justice was an ongoing journey, but with each step, he was making a real and significant impact. That night, as David and Lisa prepared for bed, they talked about the next steps and the challenges ahead. Are you ready for what comes next? Lisa asked as they settled into bed. David looked at her, his gaze filled with determination. Yes, I am. Each challenge is an opportunity to learn and grow. And together, we'll face whatever comes our way. Lisa smiled and held David's hand. And I'll be by your side as always. Together, we can make a difference." David smiled back, feeling a deep sense of gratitude and hope. He knew the road ahead would be long and full of challenges, but he was also confident that with support, dedication, and perseverance, he could contribute to a fairer and more equitable world. And so, he closed his eyes, ready to face the future and continue his mission of fostering real and lasting change.